Sam and his friends, Jess, Mike, and Nora, were craving an escape from their dull routines. So, when Jess proposed a weekend trip to an old family cabin deep in the mountains, they eagerly accepted. As they packed, Jess explained her grandfather had built the cabin, but no one had visited in years. When they asked why, Jess hesitated, mumbling something about bad memories, and quickly changed the subject. The friends loaded into the car early Friday morning, excitement masking their unease. The cabin was isolated, reachable only by a narrow, winding road that seemed to disappear into the forest. As the mountains grew closer, thick clouds rolled in, casting a dark shadow over the peaks. Jess's GPS lost signal, but she seemed to know the way by heart. The path became bumpier, and an eerie silence settled around them as they finally arrived at the secluded cabin. Standing against the foggy mountain backdrop, it looked far older than Jess had described, almost as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, the cabin was dusty and cold, filled with old-fashioned furniture and the faint smell of wood rot. There was an unsettling heaviness to the place, as if the walls were holding secrets. Nora noticed a set of faded photographs on the mantel, each face staring blankly into the distance. One, in particular, caught her attention, a young man with eyes that seemed to follow her no matter where she moved. Jess shrugged off her friend's unease, assuring them it was just an old family picture. They laughed, trying to shake off the odd feeling. As night fell, they lit a fire, settling in for a cozy evening, but something in the woods caught Mike's eye, a shadow, watching from the tree line. When he pointed it out, it vanished into the darkness, leaving them questioning if they'd even seen it. They joked nervously, but a cold draft whispered through the room, carrying with it the feeling that something was watching them from outside, waiting. The next morning, Sam stepped outside to find the ground covered in a fresh layer of snow. As he walked around the cabin, he froze. Leading from the forest to the cabin door was a single set of footprints, too large and spaced too widely to be human. Sam called the others, who stared in horror as they traced the tracks that stopped abruptly right at the door, then turned and disappeared back into the woods. Jess insisted it was probably an animal, but her shaky voice betrayed her fear. They decided to hike to a nearby peak to shake off the creepy feeling, hoping the fresh air would clear their minds. But as they climbed, an unsettling quiet blanketed the forest. The chirping of birds and rustling of leaves were gone, replaced by a low, almost inaudible hum. And every now and then they would catch glimpses of something moving just at the edge of their vision. A tall, shadowy figure slipping between the trees, as if following them. That night, the wind howled, rattling the cabin windows. They huddled close to the fire, unwilling to admit they were scared. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the room. They froze, listening as the knock sounded again, this time louder and more insistent. Jess whispered that no one should answer, but curiosity got the better of them. Mike opened the door a crack, peering into the darkness. The path was empty, but in the snow lay a single tattered page of a notebook. Mike picked it up, his face paling as he read, "I see you." They slammed the door, locking it tight, but a new dread had settled over them. Jess finally confessed that years ago, her grandfather had claimed to see strange figures in the forest, creatures that came only at night, leaving warnings and watching him from afar. The following morning, Mike was gone. They searched the cabin and surrounding forest, calling his name until their voices grew hoarse, but he had vanished without a trace. All that remained were footprints leading from the cabin door toward the forest, identical to the ones they had seen the day before. As night approached, they barricaded the door and stayed close together, dreading what might come next. Nora was the first to hear it, a faint whisper coming from outside the window, calling her name. When she peered out, she saw a dark silhouette standing in the trees, holding up the same notebook page with "I see you" scrawled across it. She screamed, pulling Sam and Jess away from the window. They felt trapped, as if the walls were closing in, and a chilling thought surfaced. What if the mountain wanted them to stay? By dawn, only Jess and Sam remained. They had lost Nora in the night. She had slipped out in a trance, her eyes vacant, murmuring that they were calling her. Jess and Sam decided to flee. As they ran down the mountain path, shadows seemed to close in, reaching out with cold, invisible hands. When they finally stumbled back to the car, they felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But as Sam started the engine, he caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a tall, shadowy figure standing on the path behind them, watching with empty eyes. They sped away, but the figure didn't move, just stood there, staring after them. As they reached the edge of the forest, Jess whispered, "We'll never speak of this again." Sam agreed, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them back, that the mountain wasn't finished with them yet. And every time he passed by a window, he saw it, the faint reflection of a shadow standing just behind him, waiting. Tom, Lily, Ben, and Sarah were longtime friends who loved the outdoors, so when Lily suggested a weekend camping trip in the remote, rugged backwoods, everyone was on board. They loaded up their gear and drove out early, reaching a secluded clearing miles from the nearest trailhead by dusk. The air was crisp, the trees dense, and a shallow creek cut through the campsite, bubbling softly in the growing twilight. They set up their tents, built a fire, and shared stories and laughter as stars blanketed the sky. When a twig snapped nearby, they laughed nervously, brushing it off as an animal. But then Ben noticed something odd. A small pile of rocks stacked neatly beside the creek that hadn't been there before. Shrugging, they chalked it up to some previous campers and returned to their fireside fun. However, a heavy silence settled as the fire died down, and each of them felt a strange chill that made them feel watched. That night, Tom awoke to the faint sound of whispering coming from the trees. It was barely audible, almost like wind passing through leaves. But there was a distinct rhythm to it. He poked his head out of the tent, scanning the darkness but saw nothing except the flickering embers of the dying fire. He lay back down, but the whispers grew louder, until he could make out his own name, repeated in the faintest, most chilling voice he'd ever heard. Shivering, he decided to wake Ben, but just as he reached over, the whispering stopped. The next morning, Tom shared his experience with the group, but they laughed, thinking he must have dreamed it. They spent the day hiking, exploring hidden trails and foraging for wild berries, but something felt off. They found another rock stack, this one larger, and placed right in the middle of their path. No one mentioned it, but their laughter grew strained as they hurried back to camp, a heavy unease settling over them. The second night, they sat by the fire in tense silence, the usual comfort of nature replaced by a creeping dread. The air felt colder, and the forest was unnervingly quiet. Suddenly, Sarah pointed toward the edge of the clearing, where a tall, shadowy figure stood among the trees. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, just watched them, blending with the shadows. Tom shone his flashlight, but by the time the beam reached the spot, the figure was gone, leaving only a faint outline in the dirt where it had stood. They tried to laugh it off, suggesting it might be a hiker, but no one really believed it. They turned in for the night, huddling close in their tents, too afraid to sleep deeply. Around midnight, Tom heard the whispering again, this time louder and coming from all directions, as if the forest itself was speaking, urging him to step outside. When they awoke, Ben was gone. This tent was empty, his shoes left behind, as if he'd simply walked out barefoot. They called for him, searching the surrounding woods frantically, but there was no trace of him. Lily found a scrap of cloth snagged on a tree branch, dark and damp, which she hoped wasn't blood. Panic set in, and Sarah insisted they leave. But Tom argued that they couldn't just abandon Ben. They hiked up to a nearby ridge, hoping to get a better view of the area, but as they looked out over the forest, they saw something chilling: hundreds of small rock stacks scattered throughout the woods, each casting long shadows in the early morning light. The rocks seemed to form a rough path leading deeper into the forest, almost like a trail meant to guide them. Reluctantly, they followed, driven by the desperate hope of finding Ben, but the trees seemed to close in tighter with every step, as if the forest was swallowing them whole. As they ventured deeper, they found themselves in a clearing encircled by twisted, ancient trees and more stacks of rocks, each one slightly different, some towering as high as 5 feet. At the center of the clearing lay Ben's flashlight, flickering dimly, and a message scratched into the dirt: "They want us to stay." Lily screamed, her voice echoing off the trees, but there was no response, only the oppressive silence. They decided to leave immediately, but the path they had come down was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of identical trees and stone piles, each looking more sinister than the last. Exhausted, they trudged in circles, the forest seemingly shifting around them, making it impossible to find their way back. Tom noticed something in the shadows, a dark figure watching them from the edge of the clearing, its face obscured, but its gaze unmistakably fixed on them. As night fell, they resigned themselves to one last night in the forest, huddled around a weak fire. Tom kept watch, clutching a stick as a makeshift weapon, but his eyes grew heavy, and he finally drifted off. He awoke to find Sarah and Lily missing, only their belongings left behind in the clearing. In a panic, he ran into the woods, calling their names, but all he heard was his own voice echoing back at him. Suddenly, he was surrounded by the whispering again, louder and more insistent, each voice merging into a chorus that seemed to say, "Stay with us. Forever." The rock stacks loomed all around, almost as if they were marking graves. Tom turned to flee, but as he did, he caught sight of the dark figure standing directly behind him, close enough to see its hollow, emptied eyes. He backed away, tripping over a stack of stones and falling to the ground. When he looked up, the figure was gone, but so were his friends, leaving him utterly alone in the silent forest. The next morning, a search party found only his flashlight, flickering faintly in the dirt among hundreds of stone piles, all carefully stacked in a silent, watchful circle. The Miller family, parents John and Ellen, and their 2 kids, 12-year-old Max and 8-year-old Emma, were excited for a weekend trip to Lake Haven, a secluded spot nestled by a dense forest. John had rented a small rustic cabin overlooking the lake, hoping it would be a perfect escape from the city. The lake was silent, smooth as glass, and surrounded by towering trees that cast long shadows over the water. As they settled in, the air felt crisp but strangely still, almost too quiet. That first evening, Max noticed something odd. A row of stone piles along the lake's edge, each about knee-high and perfectly balanced. He called the family over, and Ellen dismissed it as an art project left by previous campers. But as the sun set, the family couldn't shake an odd sense of being watched, the stone piles standing like silent sentinels under the darkening sky. The next morning, while the family prepared for a day of fishing, Emma pointed to the other side of the lake. A figure stood on the shore, its silhouette stark against the forest behind it. It looked like a person, though none of them could make out any features from such a distance. John waved, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it seemed to shift slightly, like it was tilting its head to watch them. Feeling a bit unnerved, John suggested they start fishing and ignore it, hoping it was just another camper. But throughout the day, the figure remained in the same spot, unmoving, watching. By the time evening came, it had vanished, but an eerie tension lingered. As they sat around the cabin's small fireplace that night, Max asked if they could lock the doors. Laughing nervously, John agreed, though even he felt the prickle of unseen eyes from the forest beyond the lake. That night, Emma was the first to wake up. She shook her parents awake, saying she heard someone whispering outside. John brushed it off, saying it was just the wind, but then he heard it too, a faint, rhythmic chanting coming from the direction of the lake. The words were indistinct, almost like a song, yet strangely melodic and unsettling. Ellen looked out the window and gasped. Another row of stone piles had appeared overnight, this time closer to the cabin, almost forming a path leading from the lake. A creeping sense of dread filled the family as they lay awake, listening to the whispering voices that seemed to drift from the forest, calling to them. The family huddled together, telling themselves it would pass, but in the quiet darkness, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing closer. By morning, the eerie sounds had stopped, but the family's nerves were on edge. John decided it was time to leave. As they packed their things, Emma noticed Max was missing. They searched the cabin and the surrounding area, calling his name until their voices cracked, but there was no sign of him. Ellen spotted a trail of footprints leading from the cabin to the lake, ending at another set of stone piles that seemed larger and more ominous than before. Desperate, John and Ellen called the local rangers for help, but without cell service, they were on their own. As they frantically searched, Ellen saw the figure again, this time standing at the water's edge, closer than ever, and holding something that looked like Max's red jacket. Her scream echoed across the lake, but there was only silence in return. Night fell, and with it came the whispering once more, louder and closer than before, seeming to echo all around the cabin. Ellen broke down, convinced that Max was lost to them. John, gripped by desperation, decided to confront the figure. He left the cabin with a flashlight and a knife, calling Max's name into the darkness. Near the shore, he spotted something. A shallow grave marked by stones and covered in moss, almost hidden by the trees. Inside lay a small old doll, worn and decayed, wearing a tattered red jacket. Horrified, John stumbled back, realizing the stones were not art projects or markers but warnings, marking places where lost things were kept. As he turned, he saw the figure standing in the shadows, its hollow eyes fixed on him. John backed away slowly, but the figure took a step forward, whispering in a voice that seemed to carry the echo of children's laughter and distant screams. He ran, but the figure's shadow followed, stretching long across the lake and forest, ensuring he'd never forget the place where things that were lost stayed hidden forever.